Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about the decline of generalists. And I'll describe what that is, but I've gotten a lot of questions from people who say, what's changed the most in development over the last 40 years? And I've thought about this a lot because there's so much that's changed. I mean, the nature of games have changed, the hardware's changed, the structure of companies have changed, the money involved has massively changed. The diversity in the industry has changed. The just pretty much everything about the industry is wildly different. So this is something that's very peculiar and specific to the game industry that a lot of people outside the game industry would probably have no idea is even happening. So I'll have to talk about what I mean by generalist, why they're in decline, and the problems I think that introduces. So first of all, what do I mean by generalist? A generalist is someone who's skilled in multiple disciplines. There's a bunch of roles that come together to make a video game, and I've talked about it. There are programmers and designers and artists and producers and sound people and the marketing and sales and admin and all the things that go to putting a game together. And all of these, what used to be just a game designer, now it's like, well, are you system? Are you narrative? Are you level? Programmers, are you gameplay? Are you UI? Are you network? Are you graphics? Even, when it gets into things like, we used to have a sound guy and he'd do your music and your sound effects and your UI elements. Now those often are individual people who specialize in that area. So generalists, the multidisciplinarians, it's like when you work with someone who's an artist, but he also writes for the game, or a programmer who also designs, or a producer who's coded. Now, let me just say what's happened to them. And when I say the decline of generalists, what I'm talking about is not that the quality of generalists have gone down, but literally the number of generalists. And because the number has declined, the percentage of generalists has gone way, way down as the industry's gotten bigger. Because the industry's gotten a lot bigger with people, but most of them are specialists. I have met very few narrative designers who do anything but write. I've met people who work in UX, and that's all they do. They make UIs, they do the whole user experience, but ask them their opinion on a system mechanic or a piece of non-UI art, and there's nothing there. So I understand why the rise of specialists have occurred. The industry is much, much bigger. Teams are much, much bigger. Development is longer. The detail that people expect is so much higher. It's called fidelity. The fidelity on games is through the roof compared to what they were in the 70s and 80s. And to create that level of detail, people expect, whether it's graphical, system depth, even the frame rate, you need specialists. You need people who do nothing but work in that area to tune it to a really high level. Where in the old days, you'd make a game, you'd debug it, you'd do some high level optimization, and that would result in a game with a decent frame rate that fit in the space you had, and you shipped it. Now, art is so much more detailed. Texture resolution, number of polygons per model, the number of UIs that are available. Just art alone creates a massive amount of data that has to be processed. And then that spills out to programmers and designers, sound people, production. Everybody has to deal with this huge sheer amount of data. And then that's just a fraction of what programmers are dealing with. Systems are in huge detail. So it made sense that programmers got broken up to, you're going to handle system mechanics, you're going to handle UI, you're going to handle graphics, you're going to handle networking. It has to. I've even worked on teams where we had one or two game engine specialists. So if we're making an Unreal game, there was somebody who's like, I'm really good at Unreal. I can figure out every engine I've used has had quirks. I'm not picking on Unreal. Unity had quirks. My own game engines had quirks. I know you find that hard to believe. So usually there was a specialist who was like, oh, I know why the engine's doing that. I'll take care of it. So I understand why there are so many specialists. But let me tell you why generalists were so great and still are great. And while I'm lamenting the fact that they are in decline, let me talk about some of the great generalists I've worked with. I've worked with programmer generalists who didn't specialize in any particular subspecialty within programming. They're just generalist programmers. Those are great programmers because they can link different systems together. So your UX needs sound. Well, this guy's great at that. Your you need to make a particular kind of UI for when you're doing the multiplayer section of your code, for making a lobby, for looking for players, for letting people know when their friends are also logged in to this multiplayer game. It's when you have those meetings, it's great to have one of those generalists there who's both interested in, he's both interested in the UX experience, but he knows how the network code works. So he knows how you have to set up those interfaces. Sometimes you can do those in a group, and have a meeting where all the different people, all the different specialists are there. But let me just tell you, when you have one person who knows all the disciplines, it makes all the difference. Having a programmer who knows in very detailed ways how the art is put together, that is a great programmer for speeding up the loading of the art, for doing things like blending props into terrain, for putting together your particle effect system. That's the guy I want doing it. If you have a programmer who knows the sound code inside and out and talks to musicians, maybe plays their own instruments or can just talk to musicians in their own language, I want her doing this because a lot of the other programmers will be like, look, I hooked up WYs for you. What more do you want from me? But actually having a programmer in there that goes, oh, yeah, I know what you're looking for. You want controls exposed for these things. You want to be able to blend and music together in more than just a crossfade. Once you find a programmer like that who speaks to the sound people in their language, it's great. Where I especially love generalists is in tools. When you make tools for your game, and some games are only as good as their tools, no one makes tools better than generalists, because these are the programmers who know what the artist is trying to do, know what the musician is trying to do, know what the level designer is trying to do. And they make tools that expose those controls in clear, easy ways to use. So, if there's one big lament I have, it's the decline in generalists is the decline in tool quality. Now, there are other people besides programmers that get better if they know code. If a designer or an artist knows code, they can ask for things they want. They can ask for the features they want very specifically. It involves less vague generalizations, and they can go, oh, I would like to be able to do this. I would like to be able to do this with my animations. I would like to be able to do this with my music. Can you make a tool that lets me do this? It also lets them, just by knowing how the underlying code works, designers and artists understand and can work around limitations in the engine. And every engine has a limitation. Everything does. Knowing those and working around them makes those particular designers and artists so much more wonderful to work with than ones that are constantly butting up against the limitations and demanding them to be removed. Because at some point you have to say no. And then those people are like, oh, I can't work under these conditions. But let me tell you, I've worked with producers who understand code and art and design. They're much better communicators, which is what you want in every producer. They're also really good at spotting critical paths in schedules. They will look at a schedule and go, ooh, I noticed you're putting together a bunch of animations here, but did you see that your models won't be ready yet? They can do the animation without the textures being ready, but they're going to need those models to be done. And they need to be rigged with skeletons before you do the animation. And they just see that in a schedule and they're like, oh, we've got to rearrange that. That is wonderful. That is wonderful if you have a producer who knows how to do that. So in previous videos, I know I've mentioned the term force multiplier. I had a producer who loved that term. He used that a lot. He called me a force multiplier. I called Jason Taylor, who I did a chat with on his work on Fallout, I called him a force multiplier. Force multipliers are people who, by their very existence in the team, seem to improve the productivity of everyone around them. Almost every force multiplier that I know and have worked with has been a generalist. And the way they did their force multiplication is they would hear two people talking past each other and step in and facilitate whatever they're talking about. They would notice something in the game and go, oh, I see someone trying to do this. I'm going to expose this to make it easier. Or they would just, look at a tool and go, this tool would be a lot better if it worked this way. Every one of those people were invaluable to the games I worked on. So now I'm sad that generalists are declining. I understand why. Almost everybody wants to be a specialist. It's easy to be a specialist. You dive deep on one thing. You become known for that thing. Some specialists can command a really high salary for knowing that thing, especially if that thing is complicated or there aren't a lot of other specialists. But I'm sad to see generalists disappearing because I see what games are lacking because the generalists aren't there. I see tools that aren't as good as they could be. I see developers talking past each other. I see games that are designed where individual elements were kind of made in a vacuum. And then when you play it, you're like, I love this feature, but I never use it. It just doesn't. It's fun to do this thing, but I never really need to do this in combat, or I never really need to craft or build this thing. It doesn't matter in the game because it was made by someone who was very passionate and knew how to put it in, but there was no one who connected it to other things. So I see this happening in a lot of games. I've seen generalists decline, especially in the last 20 years with the rise of specialists. So I thought I'd mention it. This may be something that a lot of people out in the industry go, I really have no idea what that video was about. But I'm kind of saying, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, but you think you want to get in the industry, I was always on the lookout for a good generalist. And I don't think anyone really sells themselves that way. But I've heard so many people on teams go, I love working with Bob. I love working with Mary because she knows how to talk my language. And what they're basically saying is, that person was a generalist and I loved working with him. So those are my thoughts on generalists.